сотрудничество двустороннее Германии и Кыргызстана, оно переходит на уровень регионального развития, то есть у нас больше фокус идет на содействие Кыргызстана в рамках Центральной Азии, поэтому вот в рамках сотрудничества с КЭУ как раз этот аспект тоже охвачен, и мы вот уже с КЭУ встречались с нашими синк-танками соседних стран, и отрадно, что мы, как всегда, креативны, первыми выступаем с какими-то инициативами, и вот данная инициатива по созданию совместного такого альянса таких аналитических институтов на уровне Центральной Азии была воспринята нашими соседями очень большим воодушевлением, да, они признают эту необходимость, готовы сотрудничать. Это значит, что КЭУ, как лицо Кыргызстана, вот в этом процессе должно обладать соответствующим потенциалом в лице вас, да? Поэтому здесь большая тоже роль вас, тоже успех этого процесса зависит от каждого из нас, как мы скоординированно будем работать. Здесь все не новички, опытные эксперты в своей области, поэтому сообща, я думаю, что мы достигнем больших результатов, тех, которые требуют наше время, да, для того, чтобы Кыргызстан не отставал от глобальных каких-то процессов. Вот. И вот в качестве примера хотела бы, насколько это важно, соседи, Казахстан, у них подобный институт экономического анализа существует с 1961 года. На сегодняшний день под этим институтом есть 12 разных центров. Вот 2 назад они открыли центр по климату. И вот этот институт существует при Министерстве национальной экономики Казахстана. Да? И все наработки, исследования, которые нуждается этот ключевой госорган, Министерство национальной экономики, оно в первую очередь запрашивает, обращается к этому институту. Соответственно, вот в рамках сотрудничества Минэконом ожидает соответствующего тоже сотрудничества, да, вовлечения, вклада важного, весомого со стороны КЭУ, от вас. Да. Поэтому я вот хотела бы еще раз подчеркнуть важность вашего, не просто так обучиться и уйти в разных своих областях, но оставаться вот в этой группе, КЭУ, при этом специально созданном центре, да, для того, чтобы мы могли бы при координации министерства помогать другим госорганам и сообща разрабатывать, продвигать зеленые инициативы, нужные для страны, для региона Центральной Азии, чтобы мы могли устойчиво развиваться и обеспечить будущее нашим поколениям. Да? Спасибо большое, удачи вам, успехов, будут вопросы, обращайтесь.
Andrei, can we have a time to introduce our participants? Do you mind?
Of course, no problem.
Yes, so we start with the offline participants and we go for online. Yes, так, давайте, коллеги, кто опоздал, да, с вами познакомимся. Имя, откуда вы? Здравствуйте. Так, дальше Умар, да? Данилов. Тогда давайте участникам, да, которые онлайн, просьба, да, представиться, откуда вы. Коллеги. Нурья, Аида, Камиля, Марал, Атай.
Если они включат этот микрофон, они должны включить.
Здравствуйте всем.
Да, здравствуйте, Нурья.
Я Нурджан Шабиева с Баткенского государственного университета. Благодарю за возможность участвовать в данном курсе. Так как интернет слабый, я включаю видео, чтобы полностью хорошо вас слышать.
Хорошо. Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Всем здравствуйте. Атай Алманбетов, программный офис ОБСЕ в Бишкеке, Департамент экономики и экологии. Рад всех приветствовать.
Здравствуйте, Атай. Так, видимо, не все коллеги, да? Плохая слышимость. Как мы все знаем, да, лектор у нас... Да, коллеги, кто онлайн сидит, просьба поставить плюсики в чате, чтобы давать согласие на запись, да, потому что мы будем потом размещать эти лекции, да, онлайн, чтобы мы могли дальше просматривать. So we now start switching to English language just because our lecture today training will be conducted in English, and I'm giving floor to our trainer, yes, Dr. Andrea Bassi. Andrea, please.
Можно попросить на большой экран перевести?
Сейчас.
Thank you. Are we ready to start, Cycle?
Yes, you can start.
Perfect. Thank you. So first of all, apologies for my voice. It's getting better. It will be even better soon. I hope you can understand me. And second, I wanted to thank you for your interest in green economy modeling, and also congratulate you for being part of this group of trainees that will work with models and different methodologies over the coming weeks. So my presentation, I'm sharing my screen now, focuses on a bit of an overview of the modeling process and the green economy model. And it is meant to give you an idea of what you should be able to do and work with by the end of your training process. So it shows a bit more of the end point of your training to show you what type of analysis you can support with your work. So to get started, I wanted to provide an overview of where we are coming from with models related to sustainable development. Again, to give you an idea for how the green economy model was conceived and how it has been used over the past 15 or 20 years. So at the starting point of my career in the early 2000s, we mostly worked on the sustainable development goals. And the general idea was that with models, on the modeling side, we were asked to identify what is the investment required that would make the sectors sustainable. Meaning, how much money do we need to achieve sustainability according to the Millennium Development Goals? Now, this implies that sustainability can be superimposed on a sector. If we invest enough, then we're going to have sustainability. On the other hand, our approach has changed over time, especially when it comes to the definition of green economy and then the establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, where the general idea is now, this is around 2008, 2010, the general idea is that sustainability comes out of the interactions across different sectors. So we cannot impose it, but it is resulting from the interactions of different sectors. Just to provide an example, if you assume that we have the economy as sector one, and the economy affects energy demand and energy supply as sector two, and within the energy sector we use fossil fuels, then we may generate air pollutions and greenhouse gas emission. And that results in an impact on human health, which could be sector four. So we see how the economy goes on to affect energy, that goes on to affect the environment, that ultimately goes on to affect human health, and how these different sectors all go on to re-affect the economy again. So this is where we started taking more of a systemic approach. to look at the system and its parts and how the parts, the components of the system interact with one another. Then what happened, if we fast forward to 2015, is that because of the international drive or interest in moving towards sustainability, primarily via the United Nations, we have started working on more detailed document. This is, for instance, the nationally determined contributions, a document that every country has to prepare to present the ambition in reducing emissions and then in adapting to climate change. So basically, it is a strategy document that is used to show what a country may want to do to improve sustainability. Now, because of the thematic focus of these documents, emission reduction or climate resilient, there is now again more emphasis on working on sectors. When it comes to emission reduction, we have the so-called greenhouse gas inventories, which are broken down by specific sectors. We have energy, we have waste management, industrial processes, land cover change, and land use practices, which includes agriculture and livestock, and so on and so forth. But the concept of sustainability remains, so that within each of the sectors, now we are going to analyze what are the key dynamics of sustainability. Now, what happened also in the last few years is that several advances have been made at the sectoral level with new methods, new models, and new data. I'm going to provide two examples just to give you an idea of the new developments. The first one is that up to this stage, we are looking at sectoral performance, at times even national performance overall. But then, with the work of the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, we started moving away from sectors and national perspective into the analysis of specific investments. The idea in this case is that if we work on specific investments, we need to understand if each of these investments will support sustainability or not. If they do, the country will move in the right direction. If they don't, then there is a disconnect between the strategy and what is being done in practice. So there is a disconnect between what we want to achieve and what we actually do. And so the analysis of investments has expanded. We don't only look now at revenues and costs, comparing them to the investment required, but we also look at the so-called externalities. So impacts on air and water pollution, impact on noise pollution, impacts on human health more in general, as well as on environmental health. These are intangible impacts, but they're nevertheless important from a societal perspective. Then a second area of advancement is in relation to spatial data using maps. As I said earlier, most of the work that has been done so far is at the sectoral or national level. But moving to the assets, to investments, it is important to know where the investments are being made. The countries are very diverse. Kyrgyzstan is very diverse, north and south, east and west. And so depending on where the investment is being made, there could be different impacts on the economy. There could be different impacts on the environment, on ecosystem services, for instance. So it is very important to know what the geography looks like to understand what are the risks, for instance, related to climate change. Certain areas may be subject to floods and landslides. Some others may be subject to extreme heat. And then know the location also to identify what are the benefits that emerge from the investment. Also in relation to how many people, what type of economic activities are being supported. So we are now in a situation where there is an interest to take a look at the strategies at sectoral and national level, and at the same time be careful to understand where these impacts are going to emerge in the country to have a better approach to analyzing the impacts of our investments. And so we are basically looking at what we call now the well-being economy, looking after the well-being of population, and then at the same time in the context of planetary sustainability, meaning that we need to take into account the impacts of climate change, which is primarily caused by other countries that have generated the most part of the greenhouse gas emissions. But nevertheless, with climate impacts and extreme weather events, climate change affects Kyrgyzstan and pretty much every country in the world. And so what we are set out to do at the moment is to look at primarily strategies that are net zero emissions, while at the same time they are net positive for nature. And so this is why the green economy model was created. It was created for a few different reasons. First, to understand how the parts of the system, the country in a way, social, economic, and environmental indicators, all interact with one another. But then it allows us to run investments, which is this component on the left, so that we are able to connect a strategy to projects to be implemented, to then determine what is the impact of these strategies and investments. And especially on the side of land use and climate adaptation, the green economy model uses maps to understand where the impact is going to emerge, to have a balanced, inclusive approach. For instance, for urban and rural areas, for areas where you may have tourism as a services economic sector, as well as areas where you may have manufacturing or agriculture. So the green economy model is really aiming at connecting different sectors together and integrating knowledge. So it's not as detailed as other sectoral models, but it can use inputs from other sectoral models to provide an even more systemic analysis. Now, the model has been applied to more than 50 countries since 2008, 2010. But what is interesting, and you will see that for Kyrgyzstan as well, is that every application is different from the other ones, meaning that every time we customize the model to the country context, we modify the equations, we modify the variables, we may add new variables that are important. For instance, for Kyrgyzstan, we added dynamics related to glacier melting, for water supply in the context of hydropower generation up to 2070, 2080. And so every country application is different from the others. What remains the same is the underlying methodology. And this is what you will learn in the next training session. You will start practicing with systems thinking at first, the qualitative side of the methodology, to then transition to system dynamics, which is the more quantitative side of the methodology. And these methodologies were created in the late 1950s in the United States. They emerged at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I can tell you a bit of a story about how these were created. Jay Forrester was the founder, in a way, of this methodology in the 1950s. And he's actually the person, the engineer, that developed the memory for computers, the random access memory, the RAM. And before his work, the memory was very large because it had to include all the information needed by a computer. But he had the idea that in the memory, you should only store the information the computer needs at a given point in time. And the information that is not needed can go back to a secondary memory that is slower, less expensive, but also bigger. So he invented the concept of feedback loop with information moving back and forth in different components of a computer, in this case, the memory. And he wanted to apply the same concept to policymaking. So he said, what if we have a methodology that allows us to identify feedback relations, basically action and reaction, in a way that we can say, what happens if I do something? And he started with industrial policy and urban dynamics. And so this is what gave rise to this methodology, the need to understand how a system responds to a specific intervention, be it a policy or an investment, but taking a systemic approach, considering the social, the economic, and the environmental dynamics that characterize the system. Now, there are a couple of images you see here on the right side to present a bit more what the methodology allows us to do. The first one here is what we call the Kanitsa triangle. And normally the question I ask is how many triangles you see in this specific image. I give you 10 seconds, 15 seconds to think about it and start counting the number of triangles that you see. There could be many or there could be few, depending on the way you look at the image. So normally the answers I receive are that there are many triangles. We have a big black triangle in the back with black edges. We also have one white triangle superimposed at the front, so this makes it 2. But if you want to count the smaller ones, this could be a third one. We could have therefore a 4th one at the top, 5th one on the bottom right, and then maybe also these smaller ones that we see on the side with this round shapes, the little Pac-Man that goes on to eat the triangle. So there could be more as well. That being said, what this image shows is that actually there is no single complete triangle drawn on the picture. We infer that there are triangles because of the shapes that we see on the image, but in reality there is no triangle there. So this is to highlight, when we work with system thinking and system dynamics, that even when people receive the same information, they see the same images, they may understand them, they may use them in different way. So in this case, there could be a person seeing no triangles at all. There could be a person seeing only the 2 bigger triangles, the white and black. There may be people seeing also the smaller triangles as well. What is important when we work with system thinking is that we take an open mind and we try and consider all points of view when developing our model and analysis, and not be confined to our own point of view. That is easy to understand when we work with national development, because there is an economic point of view, there is a social point of view, there is an environmental point of view, and many more. We tend to take the point of view that is based on our knowledge, based on our skills, educational background, personal life experiences, but there may be many other ways to see and understand a system. So we need to be open-minded when working with these models. The second image on the right shows an iceberg, and it basically indicates that we should be aware of the fact that the information we have is only that small portion that is above water. This is where we see events. These are the statistics we collect about how the system works. But then in reality, the events are being caused by a variety of other dynamics that emerge below the surface of the water. So this is where we find the laws, the rules that we need to follow. This is where to find infrastructure, the roads, the buildings, the power generation that allows us to behave in a certain way. And this is also where we find what we observed earlier, what we call mental models, our way of interpreting what happens in the system. So we need to be aware to go deeper and deeper to try and understand why a system behaves in the way it does. One final point, and then I see there is a question. The image on the bottom, this is a small representation of a causal loop diagram. You will see this tomorrow, I believe, so I will not go more into detail. But it is a way of representing how different variables and components of a system interact with one another. And so this is just to say that it's possible to put on paper, on a screen, your understanding of how the system works. Or if you work with a team, it is possible to put on paper your collective understanding for how the system works. And so this is a methodology that allows us to work with colleagues, with peers, with experts in other areas, and realize more of a shared understanding for how things are and why things behave the way they do. I can pause here for a minute. I see there is a hand raised in case there is a question. Please go ahead. I'm not sure if the microphone is muted or if the hand was raised by mistake.
Andrea, we have to get question
Aye.
the participants. Yeah.
Громче просто, да?
I have a question. You have shown that there are interdependencies between sectors, but can we also model interdependencies between states? I mean, if various neighboring states have differing climate politics, so that actions in one state show how the influence will be in another state. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very good question. So in short, the answer is yes, meaning that as we see in this image, we may have one country, one state, one province, depending on whether we look at a region with multiple countries or maybe a breakdown of a country's political structure. We may have one model fully developed for one country or region, and then we may connect that model to another one that is fully developed and customized for a different region. So for instance, in your case, we could break down the model at the subnational level to see what are the interdependencies across different parts of the country. At the same time, we could develop a model for Kazakhstan, a model for Kyrgyzstan we already have, a model for Tajikistan, a model for the other countries in the region, not only to see how they behave in relation to climate change, but also in relation to the availability of shared resources like water, energy, infrastructure, road and rail, for instance. So yes, definitely possible to develop different models. Actually, in a project for Africa on climate adaptation specifically, we are developing the green economy model for all 54 countries in Africa to make sure that we can look at standalone policy making, but also how the aggregation of actions can help regional development or the development of the continent overall. So again, in short, the answer is yes, certainly possible. Should I proceed?
By mistake. Yes, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. But do feel free to stop me anytime in case there are questions, of course. So now we move a bit away from the methodology and we start looking more at the green economy model itself. Now, the green economy model is one application of system dynamics that focuses on national development planning. And so it is targeting the country as the boundaries of the model. and the main factors that drive its development. Now, there are a few key interesting facts to mention about this model. First, it simulates from the past. It starts simulating in the year 2000 or 2005, depending on the model applications, and it continues to 2050. So the fact that the model starts simulating in the past allows us to see if the variables and equations that we have included in the model are able to reproduce the historical trends. And for what reason they're able to reproduce historical trends. So we have a good 20 or so years for the validation of the model when compared to historical trends. This is very different from other models because when we work with econometrics, for instance, that some of you may be familiar with, we use historical data to understand the relationship between variables, and then we use the historical data to extrapolate trends into the future. In this case, we don't use the data to make forecasts. We use the data to validate the quality of the equations, to then be confident that the equations are good and good enough to forecast realistic trends. At the same time, the model does not optimize. We'll find this in several macroeconomic models, sectoral models like for energy, and there is a specific reason for that. Well, two reasons actually. The first one is that it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, to optimize for sustainable development. Because optimization means that we define a clear rule on what needs to be prioritized. So in the energy sector, we may want to say that we want to provide the energy that is needed, but we want to do that at the lowest possible cost. Or we want to do that by reducing emissions as much as possible. When it comes to sustainable development, we may have a variety of targets. We have the target of economic growth. We have the target of employment creation. We have the target of low energy cost. We also have the target of reducing emissions and air pollution, and many more. And so it becomes very difficult to find one clear objective function that optimizes for development overall. That is because we have so many different opinions on what sustainable development means and what needs to be prioritized that it makes it practically an impossible task. The second reason, this is a bit more tangible, is that when a model optimizes, it basically hides what may go wrong and only tells us what is the optimal. So the model tells us what to do to optimize, to get the best out of a situation. But policymakers often do not like that. Policymakers want to know what happens if we do what they plan to do in a strategy. What are the consequences? What are the good consequences that support the plan? But also what are the undesirable consequences? Because policymakers need to be aware of what may go wrong so that they can be better prepared. The worst thing that can happen for a policymaker is that something goes wrong and they did not expect it. This means they will be criticized, they don't have time to act, they don't have time to think about what are the most effective options. So we need a model that runs what-if simulations to make so that they can see during the process of formulating a plan what will go well and what may go wrong, so that new intervention options are introduced, the strategy strengthened, and then we can run new simulations to see the impacts of the new and improved policy. Now, how do we test then the performance of a policy? We look at the impacts across sectors: agriculture, industry, services, energy, road infrastructure. But then we also look at impacts across economic actors, and that could be the public sector, businesses, households. Then we consider social, economic, and environmental indicators so that we are able to see if there is good balance between economic development and the other dimensions of development. And then we look at impacts over time, short term, medium, and longer term. We may have a policy or a strategy that does not lead to good impacts in the short term, but then it may lead to very good outcomes over 10 years or 15 years. So we don't want to risk that because of the short-term underperformance of the policy, this is going to be scrapped and removed. This will make so that we don't accrue the benefits in the medium and longer term. And then, as I said earlier, we look at impacts on a map, considering where these consequences will emerge for the country. Now, another way to assess then the performance is to do a cost-benefit analysis. You will see this very often in all the reports that have been produced to analyze the green economy plan or to analyze specific intervention options. We always try to turn social and environmental impacts into an economic impact as well. But not because everything can be bought and sold, that is not the point, but mostly to highlight that there is value in what we don't buy and don't sell. So there is value for human health, there is value for environmental quality. And so we include these factors in the cost-benefit analysis as well. Now, we do this using a few key data inputs. And this includes climate data and forecasts, normally from the European Union Copernicus database, which collects all the data that the IPCC models use. We have damage functions for different assets, buildings, power generation, power transmission lines, roads, and so on. We use spatial data, of course, on land cover and where buildings and roads are located. But then also the more standard national economic accounts, the energy balance at the country level, the greenhouse gas and livestock inventory or land inventory. So these are pretty standard model inputs. Now, these are used to put together, in a way, a model that on the aggregate looks a little bit like this image. This is, again, another example of a causal loop diagram that includes a bit more information. It includes also what are the key stocks or points of accumulation in the system. And basically the model at this high-level representation shows that when GDP grows, we stimulate consumption and the use of natural resources. This is for agriculture, for instance. And then the use of natural resources in the primary sector stimulates more economic growth. It allows us to generate value addition. Similarly, when we have economic growth, we have more investment. We accumulate capital, which is productive capacity, infrastructure, and that allows us to stimulate GDP even more. But then, if we have more investment, we need to hire people. People run our infrastructure, equipment. And so the more people are employed, the more income is being created and value added as well. So at the bottom, we have the primary sector. Here on the right side, we see the secondary sector, manufacturing. But then also we see at the top the tertiary sector. With more economic growth, the government has more budget. More gets invested in human health, education, professional training. And then we create new knowledge. So we create human capital, which is exactly the process you're going through at this stage. Hopefully, by going through this training, you will have more knowledge, you will have more human capital. And if you apply this new knowledge, you may increase productivity in the economy and therefore increase value added in GDP as well. Now, these all point to a very positive picture, and it reflects neoclassical economic theory, meaning if you can stimulate investment and you have more capital, if you can trigger more job creation, or if you can increase productivity, then your economy will grow and will keep growing. In reality, though, we have some constraining factors, some factors that reduce the potential for growth. On the one hand, if you use too much of the natural resources we have, then we are going to see ecological scarcity and the decline of ecosystem services. Just as an example, prime land for agriculture and grazing is the first one that gets used. Then we have marginal land, less productive, and that carries lower productivity and of course, lower value. And if we overuse land, we end up with soil loss. So a loss of ecosystem services, less water retention, and just to provide an example. And that may result in a loss in productivity in case there is an inundation, a flood, or a landslide, and so on. The other impact we see reflected in red with these B signs, which reflect balance in feedback loops, you will get to learn these very soon, is climate vulnerability. This is driven by domestic trends of greenhouse gas emissions and pollutants, of course, but also by a global trend of climate change and warming. And climate vulnerability will have impact on assets, on our roads and buildings, but also directly on human health, for instance, in relation to extreme heat or the impacts of floods and droughts. So this is how the model works. It represents high-level dynamics that drive change over time. What is important is to see what are the dominant factors. Is growth dominating at the moment? Certainly, yes, we see that historically. But we also see that the constraints to growth are becoming stronger and stronger, meaning the economy we have is becoming more expensive to maintain. See air pollution in Bishkek, for instance. And so we need to understand the balance between these different drivers of change. And that is what helps us informing development planning, basically. Now, what I showed you is a very high-level representation of the main dynamics of the model, but then the model is built using different modules, different subcomponents. And so there will be a variety of sectors that have to do with the economy, that is connected to infrastructure as an enabling factor for economic growth. Land use, of course, enables agricultural production and forestry and livestock. And energy is very important both as infrastructure and as a service as well that supports economic activity. We have a variety of other components of the model, of course, related to population, to poverty, but also to climate change, as I mentioned earlier, and then greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. You will get to see the model in more detail very soon. I just wanted to share a few words on how we address climate mitigation and climate adaptation, because these are the most important components of the green economy strategy that drive economic development, and also of the challenges we are facing for development. So in the case of mitigation, the model allows us to introduce specific targets for the use of renewable energy, for policies across sectors, be it livestock, waste management, but also transport electrification, energy efficiency, and more. And what the model does, it estimates the amount of emissions that we are able to reduce compared to a baseline scenario, but it also then estimates the amount of investment that is needed to achieve the reductions that we are able to forecast. Then, in addition to the investment and the emission reduction, it will calculate what is the impact for job creation. For instance, for the installation of new equipment, but also for its use, operation, and maintenance over the years. It will look at the impacts of providing access to different forms of energy, the impact on energy spending, if investing in renewables and electric cars will increase the cost of energy or not, the impact on nature for ecosystem services, if you use land to reduce emissions, and so on and so forth. And the combination of all these impacts will go on to determine GDP and GDP growth in the future under the different scenarios. So we take a very systemic view because we don't only stop at emissions, but we really want to see the impact that these intervention options generate at the macroeconomic level via consequences for social, economic, and environmental indicators. Now, something similar is being done for adaptation. And here is an example for another country, but work is on the way to fully integrate it in the model for Kyrgyzstan as well. We first look at a map to understand which areas of the country are at risk, considering different hazards. Could be landslides, could be flooding, depending on the type of risk that we have. Could be droughts, extreme heat. Then we look at what percentage of the assets that are key for development are in these areas that are characterized by climate risk. So these could be roads, could be buildings with education and healthcare, could be power generation, and so on and so forth. And this information is being used then as an input in the green economy model, together with climate scenarios, different types of climate scenarios, to understand what the consequences would be under scenarios of action and inaction. So inaction means that nothing is being done to adapt to climate change or to rebuild after the impact emerges. Or action is when we introduce intervention options for climate resilience and climate-proof the economy, so that we can see the extent to which under different scenarios, climate change impacts are important for the economy and the extent to which it's possible to intervene and reduce such impacts. Now, with this overview of the model, I just wanted to show you a few examples of the results that we're able to produce, and then open up for more questions and answers in case. So normally, we use the model for different types of purposes. We have this integrated view of the sectors that we are going to affect. And we use the model to perform either an economic analysis, looking at impacts on employment, potentially gender-related consequences, the investment potential emerging from the strategy, or we take more of a thematic approach. You see at the bottom topics like circular economy, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, net nature positive outcomes. And the type of results we produce could be used at the sectoral level for line ministries in case a sectoral strategy is being developed, or at the macro level for national plans. And we have in this case the specific example of the National Green Economy Program, or maybe more of interest to those ministries that work with investments, Ministry of Finance, multilateral development banks, is a cost-benefit analysis to understand what is the economic and financial return of the investments included in national or sectoral plans. So this is normally how this modeling work is being used, is to inform these type of plans. Now, how do we do that practically? I want to show you a couple of examples for simulations we have created with the model that you may be able to experience as well towards the end of the training. And here is an example of the scenarios that we run. We have, of course, a business as usual scenario that looks at a continuation of the historical trends. It takes into account policies and strategies already approved into law that will be implemented with certainty. Then we simulated alternative scenarios. One is to look at the impacts of the stated targets for emission reduction in the nationally determined contribution report. But then we look at possibly more ambitious cases. For instance, expanding the ambition to reach net zero at a later time, maybe by 2050. And another scenario in which we have added adaptation. So climate adaptation, not only mitigation. So you can see that the model can be used to simulate each intervention at a time, so one at a time for each simulation, or we can combine different intervention options together to see the performance of a whole plan and analyze pros and cons emerging from the implementation of such plans. And then each of the scenarios is translated into model inputs, meaning that we need to have very specific quantitative targets that are included in the model. For instance, for energy efficiency, for transport electrification, and so on and so forth. So each narrative for the scenario has to be translated into a specific target. And normally these come from existing national documents. Then the outcomes we generate if you look in this case at GDP, are numerical outcomes. And so we have in this case only the forecast from 2022 to 2050 under different scenarios. In gray is the business as usual. Then we see higher GDP, where we invest in existing ambition for emission reduction. We see potentially even more growth when we increase the ambition. What is interesting though, is that most of the growth potential comes from reducing emissions and not from adapting to climate change. Normally we find this, we see that when we want to reduce emissions, we use energy more efficiently. We reduce the cost of energy, and that provides a push for the economy. We reduce air pollution, and that improves human health and labor productivity, which also supports the economy. But when it comes to climate adaptation, if you're able to avoid climate impacts, we save money. So we are not actively investing for growth. We are investing to avoid future expenses. And so the impact on the economy is different when we do adaptation. Now, of course, we have a variety of indicators. We normally can report on more than 300 or 400 indicators in the whole model. But we can break down the analysis even more. For instance, for GDP, we have the annual GDP growth rate, which is the annual rate of change of GDP, to really understand what changes happen and when. An example in this case is the NDC scenario. The existing targets reach 2030. That is when we have the peak of the ambition. And we see here that when the ambition starts to decline, the impact on the economy in the orange line also starts to decline and gets better aligned with the business as usual scenario. So this highlights how important it is to maintain ambition and continue investing over time if we want sustained growth. Now, similarly, connected to economic growth, we have employment. In this case, we are looking at the unemployment rate. And here we can see different scenarios, again, where we see potentially the unemployment rate declining because of the extra effort, the extra investment put in place. Now, we also see that when we reduce the ambition, then the unemployment rate tends to grow back up a little bit in this, again, orange simulation. And so again, depending on what are the priorities for development, we can decide what type of investments to prioritize, because some investments generate more potential for employment creation than others. And that is visible here in this specific diagram. In this case, we see the breakdown. For instance, in yellow is greening the vehicle fleet. This is efficiency and electrification for transport, public and private. It has the potential to create a lot of jobs, mostly through the charging infrastructure. And then at the top in blue, in dark blue, we see renewable energy. And so the expansion of power generation capacity, which is also connected to the fact that we have more vehicles that are electrified and therefore more demand for electric vehicles.
Andrea, you have a question?
Yes.
So thank you. I have a question about, so this is employment rate. So we're talking about the normal 5 working days and the 2 weekend, but does it, that model can consist of what new developed countries launching 4 working days instead of 5, or and the same is for green jobs, as I understand, or we can change it as well, because it shows that 4 working days were more efficient than 5.
Yes, yes. So the model at the moment considers the full-time equivalent, which is based on the standard 5 days a week, 9 to 5 type of work. But it could be easily adjusted to make sure that we can reduce the work week, and that will generate potentially more jobs. So fewer hours per person, but the same number of hours required, increasing potentially job creation. The efficiency, that is something I'm not really familiar with. So it may well be that if working 4 days a week is more efficient, then we may not see a larger increase in job creation, but we may be able to have the same additional jobs with more efficient performance. So it's an interesting topic. It's something that we could explore and look at in more detail, but we have not analyzed that so far in depth with the model.
Efficiency is proven. So Australia, though it starts, of course, in Scandinavia and in Finland, but Germany is also, they're going to the 4 weeks of working days in a week.
Yes, I'm aware. What I don't know that could be interesting for us to analyze in more detail is in which sectors you may see an improvement in efficiency for the labor force. If it's across the whole economy, or maybe if we see it more for services as opposed to industry. It all depends, I guess, on the type of job, but it's a very, very interesting topic that we can look at in more detail. Yes. No more questions for now. Should I proceed? I promise I'm almost done.
Yes, please.
So, as I said, we have a variety of indicators, and what you probably start to see in looking at the model and the model results, and I'm showing now total energy consumption, is that the model is not only an economic model, but the use of system dynamics allows us to look at energy in terajoule, so the typical unit of measure of the energy content. But power generation is measured in megawatts, electricity in megawatt hours per year. Land is measured in hectares, jobs in number of people. And so, unlike other macroeconomic models that have to turn everything into monetary unit, this model allows us to look at physical units at the sectoral level, but then nevertheless aggregate the results with economic units when it comes to GDP, for instance. So it really allows to work together with different teams to make so that the knowledge can be integrated using the information that is typically, or the language that is typically used at the sectoral level. Now, one final slide on the sectoral results. In this case, we see emissions, one of the key goals of the mitigation side. And again, we see the baseline scenario growing following the historical path. We see then the NDC scenario declining up to 2030 and then climbing back up. And then we see the more ambitious scenario going closer to a net zero by 2050. Now, this behavior for the orange line is the result of having feedback loops in the model, the ones I mentioned earlier, where we see that if you reduce emissions because of efficiency and so on and so forth, we have a push for higher economic activity. When we reduce the ambition by 2030, what dominates the system is again economic growth. And that's why we see the same trend that we observe in the baseline scenario. And so this highlights a shift in dominance of the feedback dynamics that we have in the model. And again, what is very interesting is that we may have 500, 1,000, or even 10,000 variables in the model, but we only have 2 drivers of change. Those that are reinforcing, that amplify change, and those that are balancing, that reduce change. They tend to reduce change. Now, final slides on the economic analysis and the cost-benefit analysis. Now, what we see in this graph is an estimation of the total investment presented as a share of GDP. Of course, we estimate the total amount of money that is needed for each intervention option. But then to get a sense of how big the burden can be on the economy, we compare it to GDP. And in this case, for Kyrgyzstan, the ambition is very, very high. So we see that up to 2030, the equivalent of 15% of GDP will need to be invested in low carbon development. It's a very ambitious target, especially considering that on average, around 30% of GDP is investment. So this is about half of the national investment that should go into low carbon options. What we see though again is that after 2030, after that very ambitious NDC target, that amount declines very quickly down to about 5% of GDP. So this shows that we are front loading, adding early on a lot of the investment, what it could be spread more evenly at around 10% or 9% over time. We also see that the most ambitious scenario basically ends up being around 10% of GDP invested in adaptation and mitigation, with half of that investment in the longer term being adaptation. Now, the question that normally comes up at this stage is it worth it to invest this amount of money in mitigation and adaptation? And so that is what we show with the cost-benefit analysis. And here you see a table that presents the results where we have at the top the total investment in mitigation, then the total investment in adaptation, and different scenarios in different columns. And then the avoided cost, like what is the resulting avoided spending for energy, the avoided climate change damage, what are the added benefits in terms of higher GDP, so that we can compare what is the investment with what are the impacts of that investment. And ultimately, you see that here at the bottom, calculate the ratio, the so-called benefit to cost ratio. And we see in this case, if you look at the most ambitious scenario on the right side, we see that by 2030, we generate 1.75 SOM per SOM invested. So we have a good return. But if we wait until 2050, where we see more of an accumulation of benefits, the value is almost 3.6. So if you invest 1, you obtain 3.6 in return. And that is a very interesting outcome. Now, taking into account that this is, again, more of an aggregate societal value and not only financial performance. But it gives an idea to the government that if there is patience, even if the investment is very large, it will generate positive benefits, positive outcomes for the economy. And these benefits are shared across the whole population because everyone will benefit from reduced energy spending. Everyone will benefit from reduced air pollution. Everyone, or most people, will benefit from being more resilient to climate change. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I know we'll be in touch regularly throughout the course of the training, but if you have any other question, curiosity that you want to ask, please go ahead. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
It's right there, we have a question.
Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. I have one question regarding this analysis of cost-benefit analysis in different scenarios. As far as I understand, so the best option for Kyrgyzstan, right? It would be to stick to ambitious with adaptation, right?
Possibly,
And,
yes.
Yeah, but could you please explain what does avoided cost mean and avoided CC damage and added benefits? So I mean that if the Kyrgyzstan will invest around $13 billion into investments in mitigations, we're gonna have a additional total benefits of $47 billion. And what kind of benefits are these benefits, and what kind of investments are those investments? So what kind of investments is required? So like examples, real examples. In what areas, in what, I don't know, assets we have to invest in order to get this kind of benefit? Thank you.
Thank you. I can answer now, and then we take the other ones, if that's okay. We take them one by one. So it's a very good question. So I'll start with the end. We have a variety of intervention options in the model that are mostly based on the investments that are included in the NDC of the country and in the National Green Economy Program. So the types of investments could be improved energy efficiency in the residential sector or industrial sector, It could be electrification of energy use in different sectors. It could be transitioning away from coal, for instance, for heating in buildings, either to gas or more modern systems. It could be transport electrification, so buying electric vehicles, expanding public transport with more buses. We have a variety of intervention options, each with a specific cost assigned to it, a unit cost, and specific labor intensity. The investment in adaptation instead is climate proofing of roads, for instance, net shading for avoiding extreme heat that would reduce productivity for land, for crop production, the use of climate smart agriculture practices, more efficient irrigation to avoid droughts, for instance, and evapotranspiration. So we probably have around 60 or so different types of investments in the model that would then add up to the total amount that you see here. When it comes to the avoided costs, this is a reduction of costs compared to the baseline. So see it this way. If we improve energy efficiency, so you install a more efficient light bulb in the meeting room, from tomorrow, you will start consuming less energy and you will pay less in the energy bill, in the cost of electricity. So this is some of the avoided cost. Could be avoided cost for energy, could be avoided cost from adaptation, for instance, of fixing roads because of the impact of floods. Could be avoided costs related to human health, for instance. Now, this has to be compared with the added benefits. Added benefits are improved performance above the baseline. So let's say that we introduce climate smart agriculture practices. If that not only reduces the losses we had in result of climate change, but it actually increases land productivity beyond what we had in the baseline, then we have an added benefit. Or if you reduce air pollution and labor productivity increases above the baseline, increase in GDP, that is part of the added benefits. Then the final one is avoided climate change damage, which is if we invest in adaptation, we will have to spend less to fix power transmission lines, to fix power generation, to fix buildings, potentially. And so that is an avoided cost that has to be considered, but we single it out because it is connected to the specific investment in adaptation. So this is in a way how the cost benefit analysis is structured. It follows the guidance documents of the Green Climate Fund at the project level, but we apply it at the macroeconomic level, at the national level. And then the returns that you see at the bottom, actually, the most profitable investment is actually the one presented with mitigation ambition, up to 4.1 in return for each sum or dollar invested. Adaptation takes time to show benefits. Adaptation shows benefits if there are more frequent and stronger extreme events. So we normally look at the return on investment for adaptation under different climate scenarios, SSP1, SSP3, and SSP5. And we see that the benefits tend to increase the more we go to the extreme climate scenarios, like SSP5. So I hope this answers your question, and I'm more than happy to share more materials. We have plenty more to share if you're interested in cost-benefit analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bassi. Thank you for your presentation. It was very useful for us. So I know that you are one of the authors of the fundamental report, one of the first report prepared by UNEP and experts towards the green economy in 2009. And my question was, has the report, this report and targets in this report in 2009 based on green modeling, or there was a predictive approach based on expert assessment?
So thank you for your question and for being aware of the green economy report. It was a big effort. I was in fact the lead author of the modeling work for that report. And so just to answer briefly, a model was developed. In that case, it was the very first green economy model developed worldwide, and it was a global model. the experience we gathered in developing the global model then made so that UNEP developed country advisory services that resulted in the creation of this green economy model I presented today at the country level. And then other partners got involved, the Global Green Growth Institute, for instance, the World Resources Institute, the Global Center on Adaptation. A variety of organizations contributed to further developing the model. Now, also to answer your question, the Green Economy Report is a 600-page document, if I remember well. It includes 10 different sectors, developed in isolation from one another, with experts, about 20, 30 experts contributing to each chapter. And then we have the modeling chapter. So the task of the modeling chapter was to combine all this knowledge available in the 10 sectoral chapters into one coherent and systemic analysis. So the answer is both. There was expert information and expert judgment that went into formulating the scenarios, but then there was modeling work using system dynamics that was really the foundation of the report in developing the forecasts, in determining what would be the impact for GDP, for natural resources, for jobs, in investing in a green economy. Now, we did not have targets for green economy investments back then because it was a new conversation. And so in that case, we use a simplified assumption of investing 1% of GDP or 2% of GDP to see what the impact would be on the economy at the global level. So I would say, just in concluding, that was a modeling exercise that actually created a field of modeling, a brand new area of modeling that is nowadays connected to sustainability science more than sectoral analysis. It's really the systemic approach that was launched with that model. And it was received with praises as well as with criticism, as you can imagine, depending on the professors and the experts that reviewed the modeling work. But it did lead to a lot of new and exploratory modeling being done for sustainability at the global level. So in my view, it was a very positive experience.
Thank you. Коллеги, если есть вопросы, возможно, да, сегодня, потому что от завтрашнего дня у нас лекторы другие будут, да? Спасибо. Если у вас есть какие-то вопросы, дайте сейчас. Andrea, thank you. I suppose there will be no questions, at least at the moment. Yes? So now
Yes.
I suggest maybe Айбек, yes, can contribute. Айбек, вы можете, да? Может, когда мы какую-то вводную часть нашему участнику сегодня расскажем, чтобы на что как бы на завтра им готовиться нужно.
Можно будет задать вопрос, Андрей Баси? Уважаемые коллеги.
Да, пожалуйста.
Добрый день, уважаемый доктор Андрей Баси. Я очень рада еще раз вас видеть с нами в Кыргызстане. Скажите, пожалуйста, вот в мировой экономике какие амбициозные действия или вот такие планы реализованы именно в каких стран мира? Какие у них результаты были сравнительно?
Cycle, could you please translate briefly for me? Thank you.
Question for you. All right, should ask. So the question was about, can you give us an example, what kind of ambitious goals, yes, has been set by developed countries, which countries, and what were the results of this?
Yes. So I can share a few experiences, but keep in mind every country, of course, is different and they deal with different issues for development. And so there is always a different explanation for the targets they choose. But if you look at Indonesia, for instance, they use this modeling work to formulate their medium-term strategic plan, which is similar to the Green Economy Program for Kyrgyzstan. And then they also use it to elaborate the low emission development strategy, which reaches 2050. And they use the model to test the impact of different scenarios for emission reduction to set the date for net zero, basically to understand what could be done and what are the implications for reaching zero emissions, net zero emissions by 2050 and 2060. That is in a way the most ambitious scenario you can realize. But then they also use this modeling approach to plan for the construction of the new capital. They're moving the capital from Jakarta to Borneo, to Kalimantan, and they use the model to understand what type of buildings, what energy efficiency, what energy sources to use to already develop a capital that is close to net zero emissions. So you see in this case, different ways of using the methodology to set both national targets and urban related targets. We have other countries that have used the model for similar purposes. One example is Ethiopia. They used it for the 10-year transformation plan, for the NDC to 2030, for the LEDs to 2050, and we are working with them now for the update of the NDC in 2035. And the model is being used to understand the extent to which ambition should be increased in the new NDC compared to the previous one, because it's mandated that each NDC has to be more ambitious than the previous one. And specifically what they're targeting in terms of goals is to increase finance from the so-called Article 6, so international finance for implementing projects for emission reduction, and to maximize the potential international support. Then there are many other cases with the European Union. We work with specifically 3 countries, with Italy, with Germany, and the Netherlands, to test the plausibility of setting new targets for circularity, for the circular economy, specifically in sectors related to construction, chemicals, plastics, and textiles. So in that case, most of the emphasis was on the need for biomass, for a bio-based circular economy transition, and the implications for jobs within the European Union. So very different approaches in terms of policy goals, but very similar underlying modeling work, more systemic across these different countries. There is also new work being done in Southeast Asia to address the needs for carbon pricing. This is for Indonesia, for Vietnam, and the Philippines. This is brand new ambition of the governments to introduce carbon pricing, as there was work done in Kazakhstan in the past. I collaborated with in the green economy doctrine, so-called, to reach also in that case very large emission reductions in relation to the low emission development strategy. So different countries use it for different purposes depending on what are the key goals for development. But several countries use it for these UN-driven processes related to the NDC and the low emission development strategies, or the national adaptation plans, the NAPs.
Спасибо. Может, действительно, у онлайн-участников есть вопросы, коллеги? Коллеги, у нас... Тогда, может быть, я спрошу, да. Andrea, maybe you can provide, important tips or recommendation, yes, from the beginning, what our participants should pay attention or dedicate more time in order to learn better, yes, the systemic dynamic modeling. Yes, so from the beginning, because from the presentation first, like it's quite difficult to digest all information, so we'll be grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Saikal. I would say the one advice is to practice. Everything at first is difficult. Everything, riding a bike, working with the new software, starting a new job. But the more we practice, the better we become at what we do. So starting tomorrow, when you start exploring causal loop diagrams, I guess, and basic models. Try and practice as much as you can. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. You can learn more from making mistakes, from learning how to fix a model that shows a problem, than just doing everything right to begin with. So if you can, my advice would be to practice as much as possible and rely on Cycle, IBEC, Tatiana, myself, all the other trainers and facilitators, because it's a good opportunity to learn something new that to me has a lot of potential in Kyrgyzstan as well as in the region. I can tell you the modeling work I've done for the Green Economy Report that was mentioned earlier, back in 2008, 2010, completely changed my career. I did not expect that when I was working on that project, but it has completely changed my prospects in a positive way. So I would say if you can practice, dedicate a bit of your personal time, maybe after the sessions, that would be, in my view, a very good investment and will make your life easier because the training will cover more and more complex topics. So the more you practice early on, the easier it will be to follow. Now, one final point also that we've seen with previous training, you're not expected to become proficient at every single task. But what will be interesting, I believe, is that as you go through the training, you will realize what you're best suited to do. Some of you will be strongest with qualitative models, with the causal loop diagrams. Some others will be strongest with numbers and with the quantitative part of the modeling work. Some of you will be good on the economic side. Some others will be good at the social side. Don't be afraid. We need all these different skills, and we need a team to work together to develop models like the green economy model. So it's important that you find your place and what you're confident with. And you can only get there by practicing. So again, that is my main advice for the coming weeks.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. So maybe my last question will be, just in case if our participants will have some challenges and questions, they can, I don't know, address the question in the group. Yes, you will be able to advise.
Of course, yes. I will translate the messages to English. If you want to write in English directly, of course, I will see them and do my best to respond as fast as I can.
Okay, thank you. Коллеги, нет вопросов, да? Онлайн-участники? Yes, thank you. Andrea, yes, we will not keep you longer because I see that you are not good. Get well soon, yes, and yes, we will continue with our participants here discussing and let you go now. Thank you.
Congratulations again, everyone. I look forward to exchanging more in the coming weeks. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Так, коллеги, которые онлайн, да, не уходим, мы только отпускаем Андрея, да? Так, давайте, да, на русском, да, может быть, поговорить, потому что на английском не всем тяжеловато, да, информация. Будет неформально, да? Далее, не должно пройти, может, это позволит, да? Как вам первая лекция?
Все круто, но мало что понятно.
Да, да. У нас эта лекция будет размещена, да, на сайте. Сегодня я на себя посмотрела. Начать всегда тяжело, да? Очень много информации, раз, это сегодня что-то понимаете, да? Как я сказала, завтра мы с Сергеем, да, начнем более практически, да, занятия где-то закрепляются, а чем больше, как я сказала, потихоньку, осваиваем эти инструменты, потому что я скажу, что это не всегда первый раз можно понять и продвинуться, но мы надеемся, да, что все вы пришли, да, что все вы выделите на это время, научитесь, да, мы будем дальше с вами вместе пополнять и работать, да, на моменте, да. Ну, я не знаю. Да,
хотела все-таки Олега попросить буквально в двух словах, да, потому что сказала Андрея.
Да. Ну, это первый, да, когда вот слово тяжело. Микрофон я поставила, надеюсь, слышат нас.
Есть, да? Добрый день. Я Кадровик, один из более опытных пользователей этой модели. И, в принципе, то, что Андрей рассказал, это то, что мы за 2-3 года сделали и продолжаем делать. То есть это модель, которая постоянно развивается. То есть всегда есть детали, есть, скажем, новые какие-то вещи, которые мы туда добавляем. Но в целом логика, она очень простая. То есть все строится на, скажем, потока запаса. Это основа системного мышления. И вот эта модель, которую Андрей сегодня представил, она, в принципе, охватывает очень много областей, очень много направлений, включая там, экономику, макроэкономику, микроэкономику, социальные вещи, да, вплоть до там, здравоохранения, возможно, там, охраны туда, то есть социальные вещи тоже охватываются. И, соответственно, охватываются сейчас последние работы, это уже непосредственно связанные с климатом, с экологией. То есть это основа устойчивого развития, которое SDG, ООН продвигает. И, соответственно, то, что которые подписались, Парижское соглашение, да, взяли обязательства по достижению целей, все это как бы включается в эту модель. Эта модель, она позволяет количественно просчитать эти многие качественные вещи, которые, в принципе, мы не обязаны быть, скажем, крутыми специалистами. Да? Общее понимание есть, и есть, скажем, другие эксперты, которые вносят свой вклад. И, соответственно, эта модель позволяет учитывать, если не все, то основные факторы. И эти факторы, они взаимосвязаны. То есть, если мы проводим анализ, там, раскладываем по деталям, да, пытаемся понять, из чего состоит, скажем, та или иная сфера, там, направление, область, да, то здесь мы пытаемся, наоборот, все это собрать воедино и посмотреть, как они взаимосвязаны между собой, взаимодействуют и, соответственно, работают. Самый простой пример, да, вот, берем автомобиль, сложный, да, механически, там, можно сказать, там, одно из таких совершенств технологий. Да? Разбираем, смотрим, состоит по-крупному из салона, да? И мы это все раскладываем. Но понять, как это все работает, нам надо его обратно собрать. И посмотреть по взаимодействию. Вот это, в принципе, динамика и позволяет. Объединяем вместе и смотрим, как все это взаимодействует между собой. И, соответственно, вот эти сложные вещи, которые есть у нас, в частности, это климатические изменения, да, социальные факторы, мы пытаемся все это объединить, сделать более-менее там рабочую модель и понять, как все это взаимодействует между собой. Начиная с там низшего уровня, да, то есть посмотреть освещение, да, как это влияет, и вплоть до там макроуровня, да, как это повлияет на общую занятость, как это повлияет в целом на там, налоги, бюджет, все это можно просчитать. И эта модель позволяет существовать. Данные самые данные. Основная, конечно, это ставка. Есть и расчетные данные, да, есть, которые мы берем из других источников. Всемирный банк, там, то есть нельзя сказать, что есть все данные. Это одна из проблем, потому что с Совком сейчас 70-80% тех данных, которые нам нужны, основные принципы, они только либо работают, либо таблеты задуманы. Поэтому мы стараемся все это как бы взять из других источников. Есть международные расчеты, да? Есть и глобальные какие-то данные, там, ООН, Всемирный банк, да? То есть где только возможно. Есть определенные исследовательские работы, да? Которые уже просчитали. То есть мы пытаемся все это собрать. То, что нам надо, мы вводим туда.
А если надо какие-то данные, например, вот если
Здесь модель включает все ее расчетные данные. То есть, скажем, почту, да, плодородность почвы. Все это как бы берется либо из Минсельхоза данные, либо это все расчетные. Посмотреть там пастбища, тоже можно спутниковые данные взять, можно какие-то там расчетные данные. То есть мы не говорим, что это абсолютно проверенные фактические данные. Да? Есть, как вы все исследователи понимаете, есть определенные сферы, где не всегда данные существуют. Есть расчетные методы, да, можно посчитать. Есть какие-то наблюдения, но это дорогостоящее удовольствие, это может только проектным методом, да, нет. Но мы пытаемся все, что есть, собрать и посмотреть, как это будет работать. Включая расчеты. То есть те самые выбросы, это все расчетные данные. То есть эта модель, она позволяет абсорбировать все подходы. То есть есть там CDP, да, есть там пикап, там, то есть общие, какие возможно только данные, мы туда добавляем. Просто мы делаем сноску, да, какие данные мы взяли, откуда взяли. Это практически все делают. Четко указывается, какие ограничения. Какие методологии есть, все как бы все прописывается.
Вопрос, сколько раньше можно сами модели загрузить? Сколько
Насколько у вас хватит фантазии. То есть здесь еще раз надо сказать, что модель, она рабочая. Вы в одну область исследуете, да, скажем, там у вас диссертация, там, вы полностью все проверяете. Вы же не можете там все данные туда включить, посмотреть, прочитать. Да? Для этого нужен там суперкомпьютер, который супер подходит. Да? Но здесь, в принципе, вы просто фокусируетесь, говорите, мне вот эта тема интересна. Нежелательно, конечно, там 100 факторов, да, включить. Максимально, который у вас там подход достигнет, это 10-15 показателей. На основе каких-то там данных, да, панельных данных, там, временных данных, посчитать, посмотреть. Чем проще вы делаете модель, тем лучше для вас самих. Чем вы больше усложняете, да, там становится сложной, громоздкой, потом вам самим надо будет в этом разбираться. То есть здесь, например, более, по-моему, 1000 показателей. Но они разбиты по субмоделям. Есть маленькая модель, есть большая модель, которая все это агрегирует. И, соответственно, там, в принципе, можете разделить, там, скажем, население, вопрос населения, от чего, то есть, от чего зависит там экономические параметры, тот же самый ВВП, да, человека. То есть потихоньку все это распределяете, делите, четко указываете свои подходы, методологии, прописываете, показываете, откуда берете данные, и, соответственно, все это интегрируете. Можно новую модель сделать, субмодель, да? Интегрировать модель зеленой экономики. Либо можно взять старые данные, обновить и посмотреть актуальные данные там, на сегодняшний момент. То есть это все, в принципе, модель позволяет. Это не та модель, что там вы сделали все, фиксируете, только пользуетесь вот этими данными. Да? Нет, она постоянно растет, развивается. Для, скажем, госслужащих, да, мы можем зафиксировать, сказать, вы можете там сценарный подход сделать, да, что будет, если на 5% цены вырастет, да, что будет на 10%. То есть это, в принципе, есть модели макроэкономические, да, они, в принципе, дают, позволяют ответить на вопрос, что будет с ВВП, да, что как изменится безработица, все это позволяет, в принципе, модели использовать. Но есть, почему как бы мы постоянно совершенствуем, есть новые вещи, да, климатические изменения. Экспертов по климату у нас практически раз в 2 пришел. Данных по климату практически нету, да, Статрон пока такую информацию не дает. Гидромед, он эти данные пока держит в секрете, там, чтобы от них что-то получить, это большой, скажем, труд, да. Но, в принципе, все это сейчас развивается, более-менее данные объединяются, какие-то данные появляются, и спутниковые данные, все это можно включить. С чего бы я хотел начать завтра? Да? Мы начнем снизу, с техники. Мы не будем там сразу в климат лезть, не будем макроэкономить. Мы просто возьмем основу, да, принцип. И с азов начнем, скажем, просто как-то пробовать, да? От чего здесь, сколько воды там нужно, скажем, какая вода нужна, сколько же вообще нужно, чтобы они там сидели передохли, да? Вот эти вещи, в принципе, позволяют понять подходы в воду. И потом, скажем, разом, конечно, мы не будем проходить весь этап, да, то есть слишком время ограничено, но, в принципе, вы тоже люди подготовленные, более-менее эти вещи какие-то проскакивать, какие-то там останавливаться, где у вас есть вопросы, но в целом мы попытаемся где-то там короткий промежуток времени дать вам основы системной динамики и, соответственно, как это все интегрировано в зеленую модель. В принципе, пока все. Завтра обязательно проявите принцип. Без него, в принципе, завтра можно и не приходить. Установить ПЛ, в принципе, очень легко, просто надо зарегистрироваться. Там, в принципе, все эти данные показывают. Заходим на сайт, регистрируйтесь, ссылку на почту, устанавливаем. Это просто там определенные нюансы. Главное, чтобы вы скачали. Программу скачали.
Я сфотографировала, я.
Наши постоянные станции является участком израиля.